But one of the problems in some of the trauma therapies is about digging things up from the past. But I think really, and I think this is an Adlerian view, that what we need to do is help people find a direction forward in their lives to be able to envision a future different than the past. Because without that, the past just continues to replay and replay.
Peter, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by you today. I haven't had anyone yet talk on the podcast in detail around somatic experiencing, which is your area of specialism, and also trauma. And, when I was doing my research for this episode, it was just very, very interesting looking at the way we store trauma and just how it is applicable pretty much to all of us.
Yes.
I think a first place to start would be what exactly is trauma?
Well, there's no simple answer. When I first really encountered trauma, which was in the late 1960s and then into the 1970s, the definition of trauma as PTSD was still another 12 years in the future. So I had either the disadvantage or the advantage of not knowing what trauma was supposed to be, and especially that trauma was in an incurable brain disorder, maybe even a brain disease, that at best you could help people with medications or helping them change their thoughts. So again, I was fortunately not privileged to have that pejorative information. And, the simplest definition is, something happens and we're just overwhelmed. And we stay overwhelmed. We don't move through these distressing sensations and feelings. And as I say, the good news is that it doesn't have to be a life sentence. It's not an incurable brain disorder. It's rather something that our body does to try to protect us from the feelings of overwhelming fear and overwhelming helplessness.
Mm-hmm. I was reading in one of your articles that you were saying that the mind often can move on more quickly than the body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolute. Yeah.
And so when we have a traumatic experience that affects us mentally,
Yeah.
And we want to kind of discharge that and move on from it.
Mm.
Is what you're saying then that it's stored within our cells, and that the body is kind of there's a great book as well, isn't there? The Body Keeps the Score. Is it there?
Yes.
And how can we release it from the body?
That's right. And you used a good term. You said discharge, because the shock is a very strong energy. It's an energy that all animals use to survive an environment of threat and danger. And when we mobilize that energy in order to protect ourselves, if that energy moves through and gets discharged, then we go back to equilibrium. But often that's not the case. And we continue to replay the trauma as though it's happening in the present, even though obviously it's something that happened in the past. To answer those kind of quick questions that you're asking, this last year I finished and published a book called, in the English version, An Autobiography of Trauma, A Healing Journey, where I really use myself as the case example of the traumas that I was exposed to and that how I was able to move through it. And also as a way to encourage other people to tell their own stories, if it's only to themselves, and embark on their healing journeys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is really helpful because I think like so often we can learn from other people's experiences, right, on terms of how to move on.
That's right.
What I suppose one thing that I've noticed can happen, and maybe this is where we store things in the body, is that you can have an experience. And I was discussing it with members of my community if they had questions around this for you. And the thing that comes up is when we've had trauma and we want to be able to discharge that, often what happens is a new situation arises that is maybe symbolic or looks to be similar, that we might experience that trauma again, right? And
Yeah,
so now we become activated, even
right.
though it's not
Yeah.
there. And it can lead to that sense of panic and anxiety, even if we
Yes.
feel that we've, like, mentally, we feel like we moved on, but it feels so
Yeah,
inherent in us.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. You said it very well, Angela. Um, yeah, what you're describing is often called a trigger. So we don't know. I mean, we adapt. Humans are incredibly proficient at adapting to situations, adapting to themselves, and so we're not plagued with the trauma. I mean, so, of course, some of us are. Many of us are. Hi, Angela. I don't know what happened. Things froze, and
Don't
then it
worry.
dropped off completely.
And then it dropped off.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries at all. So I think what we were talking about there was how we can feel like we've mentally moved on from a trauma, but then something comes along and it's a trigger, and we get this very visceral reaction to it that
Yeah.
indicates it's still there, right? And that's when we become aware, actually, this is still holding some form of power over me, even though I perhaps didn't realize it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Until something happens, it might be something barely expected, and then all of a sudden we're back in the past, and in a way reliving the past as though it were occurring in the present. And I can in the autobiography, I use myself as an example. You know, it's a long story, and I talk about it, and especially talk about how I healed from it. But my family was under life threat from the mafia, and it's a long story. But if my father testified against the Johnny Dio, who was the leader, the mafia leader, that he would find his family face down in the East River. And this man was pure evil, pure evil. So as I put it together, um, I, I was brutally attacked and raped in a park which used to be a refuge for me. And I think the reason they attacked me was for me to go to my parents and break down and tell them what happened, so that they would know how dangerous and how threatening these people could be. But I never told my parents about it. I never, in a way, never told myself about it. But when I would walk to school every day, my breathing would constrict, my guts would twist. I would avoid stepping on the cracks, uh, which is a pretty standard, you know, uh, reaction to try to ward off the trauma. And it wasn't until much later that I was developing some symptoms in my body. And I realized it was time for me to take a dose of my own medicine. So I asked one of my students, wonderful, wonderful, present woman, to sit with me and to follow these symptoms, these sensations, and flashes of images, and to see where they would go. And that's where they went. But again, one of the things in somatic experience is we don't just go right to a person's trauma. We always are looking for what's the counterforce of that trauma and feeling that in the body, because once it's registered in the body, it takes away some of that uh, horrific experiences that occurred. And what came up is a memory which I felt strongly in my body, a very positive memory, when I was about, I think I was 4 or 5 years old, and it was my birthday. And my parents must have come in late at night or early in the morning, and underneath my bed they laid a railroad track, a model railroad track, underneath the bed out into the room, and then back up underneath the bed again. And when I woke up, the train was going around and around under my bed and out into the room. And to say I was thrilled or exuberant would be an understatement. I realized in that moment, I didn't have the words for it, but I realized in that moment that I was loved, that I was cared for, even though many things happened after that, which contradicted being loved and cared for. But the fact that it was there even once in my body allowed me to proceed to some of these horrific memories in a safe way. There's a Greek god or archetype called Chiron. And Chiron in Greek mythology, was half man, half animal. And that's what we are. We are half intellect and half body, half instincts. But anyhow, in more current terms, I see Chiron as the wounded healer. And all of us who are in the healing professions owe it to our students, to our clients, to do our own work and to heal our own wounds. And again, that's what I was doing with the help, with the guidance of my student. So, um, so again, when I had this experience in my body of being cared for, of being loved, of being, that those two words really fit it the best, even though at the time, again, I didn't know that. I just knew in my body that something wonderful was happening. And with that embodied experience, and that's the key, because trauma is something that happens in the body. But in order to heal trauma, we have to have new experience in our bodies, those that contradict the sensations and feelings of fear and terror and overwhelming helplessness. And it's the key to, and doing that is the key to safely visit with guidance and support those very horrific and difficult and trying memories.
So is what you're saying there then that, because often we'll think about going back into our past to revisit trauma, to try to I guess manage it in a new way.
Yeah.
Actually, it sounds from what you're saying is that the replacement, maybe replacement isn't the right word, but going back into that embodied feeling of a happy, joyful, loving
Yeah,
experience,
that's right.
and making that the feeling and sensation that we have in the body, the more that we can embrace that and wrap ourselves around it and become part of that experience, the more we will discharge the trauma experience and allow it to go. Is that, have I got that right?
You nailed it.
Oh,
You said
thank you.
exactly what it is, and yeah, I mean your insights are very salient here, are very very powerful there. You know, trauma, healing trauma. As I said, when trauma first became defined as PTSD, it was seen basically as an incurable brain disorder, and that at best one could help people change their thoughts or use certain medications. And by the way, I'm definitely not against medications. On the short term, they can be helpful, but they're not the solution. They're not a full solution. And rather than relive, the word you used, I think, was replace. And I think that's a key in replacing some of these horrific memories with those of support and caring and safety are absolutely essential in the healing of trauma, not the reliving of trauma.
Hmm.
That's a
Yeah.
bit, yeah,
And I mean, that's highly relevant, right, for people, particularly now when we, over the last few years, have been kind of globally going through so much, right? We had COVID, and then we've come to a period of political and economic
yeah,
instability in the Western world. And so I think it's, people can feel, and there's a lot of violence in both, you know, the UK and the US now. And I think people can feel anxious, right? And that word
mhm,
safety that you've used there is actually, they can feel quite unsafe.
yes.
um, it sounds from what you're saying that the more we can condition feelings of safety and love and acceptance, the more we can move through this, which is obviously very different than what the media is doing, which is to
Oh,
condition
I know,
feelings of unsafety.
really. Yeah. If you wanted to design some way to have people reactivate their traumas, just turn on the television. Um,
Mm.
I mean, these are difficult times. These are terrible times. Everywhere in the world, there's upheaval, there's shock, there's loss, there's suffering, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, I don't take sides. I work with trauma for any group or any person that's experienced trauma. But to have it replayed over and over and over again, you know, when 9/11 occurred, I was just finishing up my teaching in Switzerland. I was flying back to the U.S. And I was asked, believe it or not, by Fox News to comment on this and to give advice. And the first piece of advice I gave is don't keep the television on, and especially don't let the children see this over and over again because they replay it over and over again. And
Mm.
in the child's mind, what's happening is that this is happening over and over again. So there's no sense of safety. They're exposed to life threat constantly. And there has to be some responsibility of the media so that we don't re-traumatize our kids by exposing them to these horrific events, as I said, so that they have the feeling, the sensation, the experience of these things happening over and over and over again. And then it's not so much in your country, very big in the US. Right now I'm in Switzerland, so I can say that. Um, is that we we have violence in our schools, in our places of congregation, and it's not once or twice. Uh, virtually it's on every page of the news that there's been another shooting, and nothing sensible is being said. Well, I wouldn't say nothing, but very little sensible things are being said about that. And what we need to do as a nation, as a society, to to make sense out of this, to make sense out of it, and children, you know, they're afraid to go to school,
Mm.
and that's again, you see so much anxiety among children and adolescents. Again, it's pretty worrisome that you know probably half of the adolescents have a diagnosable anxiety disorder. And it's because they're exposed. I mean, there are many reasons, of course, but one of the reasons is because they're exposed to threat. I mean, children go to school and they have to go through drills, duck and cover drills for a shoot if there's a shooter, an active shooter. Now, I remember in the early 50s when I was in grade school, what we would do is an alarm would go off and we would have to go underneath our desks. Why do you think that was? It was in case there was an atomic bomb that we'd be
Oh, it was atomic,
protected.
wasn't it? Okay.
And again, it's just creating fear. I mean, ducking under a desk is not going to protect somebody from an atomic bomb going off. And so again, kids go over this and they experience it as the threat is happening over and over
Mm.
and over. And yeah,
I think that's hard, right, with childhood because I have a family member. You know, my father was from Lebanon, and so throughout
oh,
my childhood there was war there, and
yeah,
my family would come over, and I remember some of my young cousins. You know, if there was a thunderstorm, they would run behind the sofa
mm,
because
yeah,
it felt like there was going to be a bomb, and
yeah,
you know
yeah,
that has led to a very different experience in adulthood. Um,
yes,
for someone listening to this, I mean, you obviously went through an unthinkable experience, really. And many people listening to this will have been through things in their life that they really are struggling to come to terms with. If they use the techniques that you go through in the autobiography and they begin to embrace that feeling of safety and love and
yeah,
warmth, um, is it different for everyone in terms of how long it will take to discharge the trauma and
yeah.
start to like release those triggers?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But one of the things that I've learned in working with trauma for 50 plus years is that no experience is better or worse than other people's experience. Our experience is our experience. And we need to respect that in ourselves and in others. And, sometimes, I've seen this replay or play that sometimes, somebody says, well, you don't know, your trauma wasn't as bad as my trauma, or comparing traumas. That doesn't make any sense at all. Trauma affects us individually as individuals,
Mm.
and we all have that capacity. And I mean, even the bravest of the Navy SEALs can experience trauma, because I've worked with a number of people, who are there or in the military. Um, Trauma is a fact of life. I believe I saw that I think 70 or 80% of all people living in the United States will experience some significant trauma in their lives. Yeah, I think it was 70%. That's a lot of people.
Mm.
And as a society, we need to deal with that. It's the most neglected, belittled form of dysfunction that we we ignore at our peril. And the health effects, not just emotional, psychological effects like anxiety and depression, suicidal thoughts, and so forth. Not only that, but um, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? That yeah, that we 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 all will experience trauma at some time in our lives, and if we ignore it, I would say we're making a big mistake, and it will affect us. And again, I was just mentioning that, of course, a lot of emotional, uh, things occur after trauma, including suicidal thoughts or even suicidality. But physical illnesses of all kinds, like heart disease, diabetes, uh, lung disease, heart disease, all of these are greatly increased when the person has been exposed to trauma. And these are expensive. I think I saw a statistic once that $56 trillion are being wasted, are being in treating these kinds of illnesses rather than looking at the source and being willing to do something about that. You know, a doctor I know named Vincent Felitti, and he developed a scale and with 10 questions, yes or no. And if you check yes on three or more, then you are likely to have a double amount of emotional symptoms and physical illnesses just by being exposed to that. And, we were doing an interview together. And so there were three of us. And so we just were talking, kind of in the green room, I guess you call it. And, I asked him, I said, Vincent, you know, how is it for you when you've developed this scale, which could make a big difference in the health of the American population? And he said, well, medicine tends to be conservative. That is to say, it doesn't change very quickly, very rapidly. But that was 20 years ago. In the last 10 years, there are so many trauma-informed educational systems, and, instead of asking children why that they're misbehaving and need to be punished, we hopefully can say, what happened to you? Mm. And this can make such a big difference in children's lives. You know, mm. Yeah, I'm thinking what eventually my father went to prison because he wouldn't testify against Johnny Deal. And so we didn't have any money to live on. So my mother um, uh, took a course in education and became a teacher. And there was one boy, he was clearly what we now say on the autistic spectrum. And during the class, he ran into the closet and closed the door behind him. And he was waiting there. And after school, he was still there. And so my mother went to the closet and she just waited there and waited and waited. And after some time, the child came out and he let my mother hold him and he started sobbing and sobbing. So we all can do things. We all can make a change. And again, in writing the autobiography, a big part of that was in saying, look, not only we can make a change, but let us make a change. And each and every one of us can make a change, really, really can make a change that's going to affect children's health and their well-being. And the one thing we shouldn't do is saying there's nothing I can do. That's the one biggest mistake we can make. By the way, we spoke about safety. I'd rather talk about relative safety. Nothing is 100% safe, but it can be safe enough. Mm-hmm. And when it's safe enough, that's something, again, that we can experience in our bodies. And that supports us in encountering some of the problematic, the difficult, the traumatic things that have happened to us in our lifetimes. and to be able to do something to heal them. And that's why the subtitle of the book was An Autobiography of Trauma, a healing journey with my healing journey. And again, I deeply, deeply believe, it's not even a belief, I know that people can tell their own stories and can begin to heal their traumas. And sometimes we do need guidance from another person, somebody who's, who is, who knows how to guide people. And, that was the case of my student who really took me in her figurative arms and helped me move through the trauma and out of the trauma. And as horrific as it was, I was able to put it in the past where it belonged. And so it wasn't continuing to plague me. And that's, I think, the good news about trauma. Yes, it's a fact of life, but no, it does not have to be a life sentence.
Mm.
So with
and putting it in the past is very powerful, right? Because actually it can't, the boat, I think it was Wayne Dyer who talked about the boat cannot be controlled by the waves behind it. Otherwise you just, you're not going to go where you want to go. And I think it's so true. I'm curious a little bit. I was reading, and some of your content around Carl Jung and, his form of therapy. And I've definitely done some Jungian therapy myself. And that sort of takes you back to sort of analyze where those beliefs might be coming from, and things that happened to you that might be informing the way that you're showing up now. I recently read a great book called The Courage to Be Disliked, which actually opened up Adler's psychology to me, which I hadn't come across previously. And I found it quite refreshing because Adler seems to embrace the forward very much so, right? It's looking at the front of the boat, and it doesn't seem to matter because what's in the past is in the past and we can be forward looking. I'm curious as to your thoughts on the dynamic between those two like forms of psychology, and how much time we need to spend on the past, or how much we should be letting go in order to embrace a new future, and what that balance is.
Right. Yeah. One of the, we talked about this, but one of the problems in some of the trauma therapies is about digging things up from the past. But I think really, and I think this is an Adlerian view, that what we need to do is help people find a direction forward in their lives to be able to envision a future different than the past. Because without that, the past just continues to replay and replay. So I think that's a real key in good therapy and productive therapy, is to really help people orient to where they want to go in their lives and then to follow that. And speaking of Jung, another thing that I talked about in the book is in the 70s when I was working on my doctoral dissertation and starting to teach my work to a number of Berkeley therapists. It was these were long days, and there was a restaurant on San Pablo Avenue called the Beggar's Banquet. I actually gave a talk in a bookstore some time ago. If you can believe it, there actually are bookstores. And this woman who was sitting up front to my left, she said that she would also go to the Beggar's Banquet. So I'm sure the two of us were there eating our meals at the same time. Okay, so anyhow, they would seat me at my usual table with two chairs, and they would usually, they would greet me by name and would start and I would usually start with a bowl of soup with some crispy French bread, like crispy on the outside, moist and soft on the inside. And it's like the day, the events of the day just kind of receded, and I could kind of reset myself as I was seated there and enjoying that wonderful meal. So one day they bring the soup, and strangely I see a shadow coming from the left side, and it's a man with wild hair and with a crumpled jacket like 2 or 3 sizes too big. And he kind of uh, gestured to the chair on the other side of the table. And so I realized I was supposed to invite him. I couldn't invite him in, and I did. And then I realized that that was Albert Einstein. Okay, so I'm not
Wow.
crazy. Jung talks about active imagination, and it's an incredibly important process that lets us connect our conscious and unconscious processes. And it's something that when I did a little reading about it, research on it, it's something that supposedly only children, once they're adults, they outgrow this active imagination. And I remember thinking, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Adults need active imagination even more. We don't want to deny that because it opens up new vistas. And again, that was a gift that Jung, although I never met him in person, although his niece was actually one of my students in Switzerland. And and these conversations went on for over about a year. And again, you know, I realized that this was my imagination, not in a negative sense, but that um, that it was more than that somehow. Then, about 25, 30 years ago, at least 30 years ago, I was visiting my parents who lived in New York, and I was downtown going to museums, and at the end of the day, I would took the D train back and walk up the hill and open the door to their apartment. And the two of them were sitting on a sofa and a couch, but above them there was a bookshelf. And I noticed that Einstein's theory of relativity was one of the books on that bookshelf. And that prompted me to tell my parents, primarily my mother, about my imaginary encounters with Albert Einstein. And my mother stood up straight and she said, and I'll never forget these words, Peter, you didn't imagine it. It really happened. And I thought, what is she talking about? And then she went on to describe that when I was 8 months, she was 8 months pregnant with me. I was 8 months in utero. And they were canoeing. My mother and father were canoeing on a lake in New Jersey. And a strong wind came up and tipped off of the canoe. And they couldn't right the canoe, and they were certainly sure to perish. Except that along came a small sailboat with two people, an old man, again with really wild hair, and a young woman. And they introduced themselves as, ready for this, Albert Einstein and his stepdaughter. And my mother reasoned that because he saved all of our lives, saved my life, of course, that I would always be bonded with him and would always attach, and that he could be called on in times of need. And so, yes, there was active imagination, but there was also a deeper truth that was revealed by my mother. And I think my mother, if she had been, alive during my time, that I think she would have been listed as I don't know about a psychic, but certainly an intuitive. And that's one of the gifts that I want to honor my mother for, is that that this gift of intuition, and that served me very, very well in my life, in the unfolding of my life. So these things happen, and you know, and yes, they involve imagination, active imagination, and also they can be a reality. And so I've learned to trust those kind of encounters throughout my life, and I still do. And actually, when I'm in, one of the things that I always do for myself is sometimes people ask, well, Peter, do you do any ongoing therapy? Like, I'm assuming that I would say no. I say no, absolutely. And here in Zurich, when I'm teaching here in the summertime, I work with this wonderful Jungian analyst. She's in her late 80s, and it's a real gift to have somebody there to reflect your mind process. And so I think, again, it's a gift. Maybe you could call it even a necessary luxury to be able to have somebody to reflect with. Of course, that's different than really having somebody to work through the deepest parts of our traumas, but it's also an ongoing process that continues to support our growth. And again, I'm really appreciative of having that capability with this particular Jungian analyst.
It's really incredible, an incredible story. I mean, I guess the question becomes, how do we imagine better? Because on a very sort of, I guess, like simplistic or obvious example where we see it, an example of trauma that frequently occurs is an entrepreneur who is making their way in business and then they lose everything. And there will be those entrepreneurs, and that's traumatic for the family, for everyone involved.
Yep.
But there'll be these serial entrepreneurs who can make it back, make it better, create an empowering new future. And they seem able to discharge that very effectively. And certainly a lot of wealthy people, if you ask them, if you lost everything, what would you do? They would be very clear that they would know exactly how to do it again. Do you think that there are, there's obviously differing forms of trauma, like your trauma experience was incredibly abusive, right? In terms of what happened. Then there's trauma, like I've just described, that are more life circumstantial. Do you think, though, that some people are able to do this more effectively? I guess the question is for people listening is, how can we imagine better? Because that's really what gives us that positive outlook and future.
Yeah. Again, well said. I mean, I've worked with a number of, pretty high level CEOs who had just what you just described, and some of them, like you said, they bounce back, and they know that they can repeat what they've already done. But others are really decimated because their whole identity is based on that. And also, in doing some work with organizations, when the organizations are highly competitive and not cooperative, then people are more likely to suffer those kind of trauma because they don't feel that mutual respect. I think that's really quite important. And in a way, those organizations that are cooperative are much more effective. I mean, yeah, to some degree, you know, people can are competitive, and in degrees, that's fine. That's how a lot of things get invented. It's like this thing I'm looking at you in with, and that took somebody's individualistic talents to make these kind of things. But you get even more vibrancy when people are cooperating with each other and learning from each other and teaching each other. And again, these are some of the things that help buffer us against being overwhelmed and traumatized. And again, often people who are in high level of business, when something happens and they lose that, they lose their identity. And so in working with trauma, very often people need to find a new personhood, um, a new identity, not an identity made on trauma, but an identity made on moving forward in life, and working with people where there's mutual respect and cooperation. That's really where I think our greatest discoveries come from. And I think we recognize that when we see that the team is working, a team is working together, we know that they are going to be more effective in whatever they're doing because they feel the support from other people. And support is absolutely necessary. We are, as a species, we're mammals. And the big strategy for mammals, especially for primates and human primates, is that our biggest strategy is not competition, but is rather uh, cooperation. And, even animals have, made this discovery in their own species. One thing that comes to mind are dogs, which all evolved from wolves. But their strategy was not the survival of the fittest, but the survival of the most cooperative. When dogs learned how to be with human beings, they didn't have to fight for every scrap of food. Things came out of that relationship. And so relationships are extremely important, Angela, in cultivating relationships, and especially in healing from trauma, to have that support from others, to not be alone, to not feel completely alone, and to be able to feel safe enough to be able to move through some of these difficult periods in our lives.
Yeah, that's so true. I think it's just so beautiful the way you framed it. And I think so much of it comes back, right, as this sort of sense of returning to love and embracing those relationships, and also love for ourselves. Because I think what you pointed out there is that, when that trauma is wrapped and intertwined with a loss of identity,
Yep.
it can take so much more of a powerful hold over an individual than if it isn't, and it was just accepted that, yeah, this happened, and it's in the past and I can move on. Whereas when it's intertwined with identity, it becomes harder. Where can people find more of your work, Peter? You have a new book out, the autobiography book. Please share. I know that my listeners will be keen, many of them, to dive into it.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you go to the website, Somatic Experiencing, one word.com, there's a lot of links. Also to find a therapist, it links with traumahealing.org, because there are now trainees in 44 different countries throughout the world. And so you can, and also in the Somatic Experiencing, some of the interviews or different YouTube things that I've done, I think they're also listed, as are about a dozen of my books. And the most recent book, autobiography, one of the people who endorsed it wrote, "This man's journey from searing pain and self-hatred to self-love." And I think that's something that's available for every one of us. It may take some doing, and it usually does take support, but we can move from self-hatred to self-love. And I think that's maybe one of the thoughts I'd like to leave with your viewers.
I love that. Thank you. And I'm super grateful for all your work and for you sharing what clearly was a very traumatic experience, and just sharing those parts of yourself. And I think it will inspire many people to
Yeah.
move to that place of self-love. So
Yes. I
thank you,
hope
Peter.
so. And that was my intention. You know, when I originally started writing what became the book, uh, I had no intention of publishing it. This was really at the age that I am now, even though I'm, pretty vital. I certainly have less years in front of me than I have from the moment of conception to now. So I really wanted to excavate my life and kind of put together a coherent narrative. And a friend of mine said, "But Peter, you should write this as a book." And I said, "No way. It's too personal. It's too vulnerable." And she said, "Well, think about it, because I think it could help a lot of people on their own journeys." And so I couldn't decide. And sometimes when I'm in a moment or a time of indecision, I'll have a dream, an important dream, again, talking about Jung. And in this dream, I'm standing in front of a large field, a large meadow. And in my hands, in both hands, I have a whole bunch of typewritten pages, obviously some kind of a manuscript. So I look from left to right, right to left. And in that time of indecision, all of a sudden this strong breeze comes from behind me and takes all of these pages and scatters them into the field, into the meadow, to land where they will land. And then I realized that my unconscious had made the decision to write it, and with the knowing that it would help people on their own journeys. So that's the story of how it started, and here it is.
It's incredible. I'm so glad that you did, and that you've
No,
shared it,
thanks.
because, as you say, it's so brave to be vulnerable, but it has
Yeah,
so much power to help others. And so,
exactly. And
thank you.
vulnerability is what we need much more of: transparency and vulnerability. So, hey, good to be speaking with you. And the questions you have asked, Angela, are very thoughtful. So obviously you've thought quite a bit about this topic, and I hope the book is useful and helpful for you.
Very
Okay,
much so.
okay,
Thank you so much, Peter.
yeah,
It's been such
sure
a
bet,
joy and a pleasure.
yeah,
Thank you.
indeed, igualmente, equally. Okay, ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Take care.